Chapter 8. Chinese aircraft carrier Liaoning, 150 miles west of San Francisco. General Kim Bong. General Kim Bong sat in his quarters going over the plan to secure the west coast of North America. Bong was no stranger to the fantastic, but even he was nearly overwhelmed by the thought of a full-scale invasion into the United States of America. The civil strategy for an attack on America was to cripple her on a workday during the hours when commuters were at their place of employment, which in many cases were large cities across the country. The military strategy was much different in its design and implementation. While much of the U.S. military machine would not be affected by the electromagnetic pulse devices being used, a significant number of the U.S. military's equipment would be rendered damaged or completely useless. Their warships would remain functioning, as would America's feared submarine fleet. The U.S. wouldn't be able to move troops within her borders by train, air, or motorized vehicle on a large enough scale to combat a well-organized invasion. This is what Bong's plan hinged on. Missile strikes targeting strategic military facilities or manufacturing plants would be carried out, with no communicative electronic systems or devices operating to tell them of current events. Most American people would remain oblivious to those actions. Most of the U.S. population wouldn't even know they were being overrun until it was far too late. Once China controlled America, the rounding up and elimination operations of key potentially dangerous people could commence. The list of dangerous Americans was broken up by region and categorized with a valuation assigned to each person. Some of the most dangerous people on the list were nothing more than bloggers and podcasters. These people had shown an ability to organize and influence great numbers of people, and China could not have that. After all, wasn't that exactly how America was born in the first place? Men like John Adams and the Sons of Liberty had gathered under the Tree of Liberty to talk about the injustices heaped upon them by England, and a revolution was born. Bong was well aware of American history and understood the first meetings happened nearly a decade before America declared her independence. He would make sure no seeds of dissent were allowed to germinate once he controlled the land. A soft tap sounded on his door, moving Bong from his seat to answer the knock. Min Ju-chu, North Korea's top general, stood outside. Stepping aside, Bong admitted the man, and together, and without words, they sat at a small table in Bong's quarters. Bong poured tea, and they sipped the steaming hot beverage in silence. Bong was aware of Chu's misgivings regarding the arrangement Chu's supreme leader held with China. North Korea would provide men and equipment for a full-scale land invasion originating in the port of Portland, Oregon. Bong hadn't considered an assault on the U.S. originating from Mexico for even a moment, not with an entire Marine division blocking their path less than 100 miles north of the Mexican border. Bong reached out and pushed the invasion document in Chu's direction to indicate the other general should look it over. The document was an ever-evolving article that both men were afforded input into, but only Bong held the power to have the final say on what would be their ultimate design. Go ahead, look it over. I've made some changes, added a few things we think will assist your government along the highways. Bong spoke in Mandarin, which Chu spoke and spoke well after being educated at Beijing's Language and Cultural University. Chu attended other higher learning institutions, but that was where he learned the language along with Chinese culture. Chu leaned forward and took the thickly paged document. For several minutes, he leafed through the many pages, stopping on a page to inspect it with a closer eye before moving on to the next page. Halfway through the document, Chu looked up. I see you've removed my suggestions for more Chinese involvement in the ground effort. Bong bowed his head in acknowledgement before speaking. Ours is a delicate position, General. I still harbor some doubts about this plan's longevity, and China must remain off of U.S. soil until our men have ensured America is unable to rise from her knees. Although we've been quite successful at nearly making Canada an ally, having Chinese troops so close to the border would test even their leaders' greed-skewed view of our relations. We can't fight a war on two fronts, and our friends from Europe are not in a position yet to allow China to rattle our sabers and promise to rein the North Korean army in, until it is too late. Chu nodded slightly. I am uncomfortable with the KPA assuming all the risks, but I am also aware there is a risk-reward factor at play. Again, Bong bowed his head in acknowledgement. My pilots will not be afforded much quarter if one were to be shot down, General Chu. We also assume much risk. Chu turned to stare out the tiny portal, the ocean passing below it roughly 15 knots as China's newest carrier churned parallel to American waters. He'd never been to sea, and therefore had never been aboard a ship that size, let alone a modern aircraft carrier. His pride refused to allow anyone to see his childlike wonderment of his surroundings. Chu's mind wandered to his greatest concern, which was that they'd grossly underestimated the Americans' ability to cause China to withdraw, leaving Chu and his men stranded on the American continent. Simply put, North Korea did not possess the ability to bring their people home, if that occurred. He fostered no illusions about what the Americans' response would be if that worst-case scenario arose. He and his men would be hunted down and executed, plain and simple. America may try to sell her virtuous ways to the rest of the world, but Chu was in the game and knew all too well the real and very violent underbelly of the U.S. government when they were threatened. He'd studied America's bloody Civil War, after which he'd realized America's federal government would do anything to remain in power, including killing hundreds of thousands of their own people. That real possibility was what haunted Chu's dreams when he slept. Bong and the rest of China's brass assured Chu that U.S. military might was reduced to a tenth of its power just 72 hours prior, and that reduction in strength would tip the scales in their favor. You'll be fine, Bong soothed, knowing full well they were both in for a long and bloody conflict. Bong had also studied America's wars, only he'd focused on her failures in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, and wanted badly not to repeat his enemy's mistakes. Once our supply line is in place and we control the Western infrastructure, we will bring this meddlesome dog to heel, once and for all, he added confidently. Chu returned his gaze to the glimmering sea, his thoughts on the lines of armored vehicles he'd soon command, streaming south through Oregon and California. While Chu fought on the ground, China would be fighting for air superiority in order to cover Chu's advance south through two of the three states bordered on the west by the Pacific Ocean. Sensing his partner's tension, Bong attempted to ease his friend's anxiety further. The first blow is half the battle, he said, citing an old Chinese proverb. Chu didn't smile as he countered with an old Chinese proverb of his own. Let him who does not know what war is, go to war. Bong only bowed his head in affirmation of Chu's reply. Mike and Tim were kept waiting longer than the 10 minutes Roberta had claimed to need in order to come to some sort of decision. After nearly 30 minutes, the door to the council chambers opened and Chief Clarity stepped out. He approached the two Green Berets, but stopped outside of Mike's kicking range. You guys want to come back inside? The soldiers followed the cop back into the chambers where everyone sat solemn-faced and resolute. They were all seated around the table with Roberta at the far end, facing the soldiers as they walked through the door. Please sit, Roberta offered with a hand gesture towards two empty seats. Mike and Tim sat, pushing their rifles to their sides, then waited since it appeared fairly obvious Roberta had gathered herself and was doing her best to exude an air of control and confidence. She did not disappoint. First off, she pointed at Mike, owe Randall an apology for assaulting him earlier. Not happening. Move on, Mike said tersely. Excuse me? Roberta snorted indignantly. I'm not going to lie to the man. Hard lessons are ones not easily forgotten. Now move along, please." Roberta's lips parted, but she didn't say anything. Clarity stared at her from where he sat, as if waiting for her to force the apology. After a few seconds, she closed her mouth. "Mr. Blakey, we've talked about what you've said is happening, and Dan, our head of public works, agrees that what you've suggested can be the only answer to the widespread damage to our power and electric infrastructure. I'm not inclined to work alongside or associate with men or women who use violence to achieve their objectives, but it seems I have no choice in this matter." Mike drew a breath, wanting to sound relaxed, smooth, and not like a jerk when he spoke. These people were a tough pill for him to swallow. At least the chieftains he dealt with in his past were all warriors, hailing from a lineage of warriors dating back to who knew when, whereas the folks sitting in front of him had managed to become some of the most helpless humans he'd ever met, all in less than 2 generations. "Roberta, I am sorry for one thing, and that's to have to be the guy who comes in here and breaks all this bad news. I know it's a lot for many, if not all of you, to digest. I assure you, though, this threat is real, and the highway out there is going to be the battleground. There's no way they can fly men and equipment in the way they can drive stuff in. We still hold a decent air presence just outside of California. People are going to die out there. People from both sides. It's war. I just want to make sure Tim and I aren't being undermined in any way when this jumps off." "No one will be undermining anyone," Roberta said, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. "You say that now. They aren't going to just blast in here. They're going to do the same thing we're doing. It won't be long before a team shows up with promises of aid and support, and when that doesn't work, threats against you, and then your families will follow." A nervous tension thrummed throughout the room at the suggestion they and their families could be in danger. "It's a real thing," Mike continued. "The easy thing will be go along so no one gets hurt. But that's the wrong move. Do that, and everyone loses." "We all have families here," Dan said, his face creased with worry. Mike nodded knowingly. "There are a few things you can do to safeguard them. Nothing is foolproof, but every little bit will help. Move your families. Destroy any paper trail you have here of who is who and where they live. Having said that last part, be assured the guys rolling in here will already have all your information. They've been hacking U.S. databases for decades. Also, when this forward team arrives, we kill them. And to do that, I'll need your help." That last proclamation left the group astonished and confused. Clarity spoke up this time. "You're saying if a delegation shows up, we're supposed to just murder them?" "They won't be a delegation, Mac. They'll be highly trained foreign special forces soldiers, trained to come in and either bribe, threaten, or murder their way to mission completion," Mike snapped back, staring at him until the man looked away, seeking eye contact with a peer whose intensity wasn't as unsettling as Mike's. Mike shifted his gaze to Roberta. "This is why I need as many of your police officers as Tim and I can get. That forward element will be here sooner than later. I'm a little surprised they haven't already made contact." "This has to be on a volunteer basis," Roberta said. A small quaver in her voice told Mike she was beginning to realize the truth of her predicament. "Agreed, but there will come a point where every person in this town is going to have to pick a side." He leaned forward, locking his hard gaze on Roberta's bloodshot eyes. "You and your people better talk about what to do with those who assist the enemy." He saw Roberta's throat move as she swallowed hard at the thought of what he was suggesting. "That's right, city manager. Traitors will get the rest of us killed, so you better have a system in place to ferret them out and the stomach to do what has to be done once they're identified. If you need help, Tim and I can assist. We've been through all this before." Roberta shook her head as if clearing cobwebs. "Wait. Back to this special bunch who you say will come here and make contact. How is a foreign country going to get people ashore? And how would they even know where or whom to come to?" Mike ran a thick, calloused hand through his hair in exasperation. Someone with the wherewithal to pull off what's been perpetrated against the most powerful country on Earth will have the ability to get troops ashore, at least in small numbers at first. Secondly, they'll also have every shred of information regarding who is who in every single town across America. Didn't you all pay attention to all the past data breaches that China or Iran was suspected in? Hell, Roberta, they may come to your house in the middle of the night. Clarity caught Roberta's worried look and shook his head as if telling her, not on my watch. Not going to happen, Roberta. I'll detail a couple of guys around the clock. Mike waved his hands in the air, his gaze down at the table, his patience wearing threadbare. No, 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 no cops. They'll kill your guys. We need to allow first contact. And Roberta? Mike raised an eyebrow her way. You need to sell compliance. Tell them you'll get your counsel on board and arrange a meeting. That's when we hit them and kill every last one of them. We fire the first shot, folks. This is our country, and they don't belong here. You need to realize this. There will be no negotiating with these people. After the meeting, Mike waited for Roberta, who seemed shaken by her role as the point of contact for an invading force. Hey, Roberta, don't stress. They need you intact and on their side. They're not going to hurt you as long as you sell them on compliance. These other countries have been studying our weakening culture for decades and know we will always want to escape harm, enrich ourselves, and take the path of least resistance. Except this time, he consoled with a broad grin before getting to his feet. Remember, it's our country. After the meeting ended, the Green Berets walked the short distance to the front of the building where Clarity stood with a few others. Hey, Mike called out, where are all your cops? Clarity looked up absently. Where do you think they are? We need to move them off-site and get everyone to alternate locations. These guys will want to hit your cops before they do anything else. You're the guys with guns, so you gotta go, Randall, he finished, realizing how much the job was growing by the minute, and he hadn't even begun to stack the bodies of his enemy. Put 'em where? Clarity asked dourly. I don't know, Randall. This is your city. Put 'em in a shop, a bakery, or any place you can safely hide your cops and their leadership until after we dispatch this forward element. I thought I was fired, Clarity shot back. You are, but I still need you to order your men to a safe house so they don't get killed before we even get started. 4 hours later, Mike and Tim stood inside a large sportsman's warehouse talking to 8 cops, 4 of whom were so grossly out of shape, Mike wouldn't have sent them to the PX for gum, let alone asked them to participate in combat operations. The other 4 were in decent physical condition, and 2 were former Marines with combat experience, which Mike had to drag out of them. That small fact made him feel good about the 2. They weren't braggarts or boastful dipsticks, and he could work with that. When Roberta arrived at the warehouse, Mike cornered her, having thought more about how to outfox the incoming Special Forces dudes who he was sure would set up and watch whatever targets they intended to contact. He didn't want attention brought to the warehouse, but he would need to communicate with Roberta regularly. Hey, Roberta, I have a plan to keep all this rolling smoothly and keep you as safe as possible. She faced him, neither defiant nor compliant. Her face placid as she waited to hear the plan she was already pretty sure she wouldn't agree with. You should carry on like nothing has changed, Mike started. Go home tonight and come to work tomorrow, but bring a wig and a change of clothing with you. If you've been contacted, I'll need you to change out at the city building and leave through the best exit that won't draw attention. If you ride a bike to work, walk over here. I don't want anyone watching your movements to suspect the person leaving might be the same person they followed to the city building. I'll leave all the clothes and wig stuff to you, but it's important you don't lead anyone here to the warehouse. If someone is following you, Tim or I will deal with that. He laid out the course he wanted her to take to and from not only her home in the city building, but also from the city building to the warehouse. He and Tim would sit in an overwatch position to make certain she wasn't followed. As their plans were hashed out and he began to assign people lookout positions around the city, the residents involved grew more serious about what they were doing. Mike wasn't kidding himself about any of the residents. If any of them got caught, and roughed up in even the gentlest manner. He'd have company at the warehouse. None of these Americans were going to not talk in order to save their own hides. It wasn't any different than how the Middle East had treated him, so he just sighed and reminded himself, it is what it is. The watch teams were made up of 2 people for each post. That was done so one could run information back while the other remained on post. If something important occurred while one person was gone, then the last person could return with the information. They outfitted everyone with bicycles to make the flow of information as fast as possible. In the absence of radios, that flow was going to be excruciatingly sluggish, and he reminded himself to exercise what little patience he had left. Late that afternoon, Mike took a moment to warm a freeze-dried meal and eat. His mind raced over all the details of the rushed orders he'd issued these people, and he wondered if he'd erred on anything. Then he remembered Sun Tzu. Of course he'd erred, and people were going to die and or get hurt. There was no way around that fact, considering what he faced. His was an impossible mission, considering he didn't know who the enemy was. Sun Tzu was pretty clear about that folly, and Mike was just thankful he knew himself. Know yourself, and don't know your enemy, and you will lose one battle for every one you win. If he could tilt the playing field enough in his direction, then just maybe they could smoke the guys who made contact, and then he'd know who his enemy was. If he failed, well, there was one of those losses Sun Tzu wrote about. Finishing eating, Mike pulled the 2 Marines in for a little one-on-one. Alex was 30 years old and had been an 0311 infantryman. That was nothing special, but then again, Marines could be relied on to kill, break, or destroy almost anything you aim them at, so maybe he was a little special. Alex was a barrel-chested, chew-in-the-mouth California boy who looked like he belonged in the Midwest instead of the West Coast. His arms were covered in tattoos, and Mike felt certain his chest and back were no different. Manny, the 2nd Marine, was a 33-year-old Latino who had served in the Middle East as a Marine machine gunner, or 0331. He was tall and rangy, more like most of the scout snipers Mike had met. Definitely not like the machine gunners he'd known. Neither of the Marines fit their MOS role in a physical sense. More often than not, machine gunners were big burly kids, built to carry the big heavy gun and all its ammunition, while the tall lanky ones usually found their jobs on the battlefield that required a lighter load but demanded endurance. Okay, you 2 are going to be my go-betweens. I know it seems like I'm not using your talents, but that time will come. For now, I need you, Mike jabbed a finger at Alex, to roll with Tim and I out into the field. Manny, you'll stay here. If any information needs to get from us or to us, you guys are it. When it's time to shoot and scoot, you 2 are with us. Alex smiled a toothy grin, knowing he was about to be loosed right here in America, and it was for a cause he stood firmly behind. Manny, on the other hand, didn't smile. He just nodded, staring at the ground, his face unreadable. Mike didn't have time for any couch sessions and hoped Manny was the type of guy who'd gone to war, thought he'd never see it again, and was simply processing being pulled back into the chaos of battle. After hours, most of the city's leadership went home to their families, all those except the commuters, who were essentially stranded at work. After the departure of all who were leaving the warehouse, Mike, Tim, and Alex slipped away from the warehouse in search of a place to hole up and be able to watch as much of the town as possible. Alex suggested a hotel in town that stood as high as any other building and was as close to being centrally located as they could ask for. Thankfully, they found the hotel mostly vacant except for a few stranded tourists and a couple of homeless types who were viewing the recent crisis as something of a godsend in regards to shelter. Cautiously, the 3 men moved to the top floor, where they chose 2 rooms across from one another so they could have eyes on both sides of the town. Mike laid a map out and began poring over it while Tim set up a tripod with powerful binoculars in the next room. "Alex," Mike called out. When the other man approached, Mike pointed at the waterway cutting through Petaluma. "Is this usable?" "Oh yeah, man, you can get out to sea from downtown." Immediately interested, Tim stopped what he was doing and sauntered over to peer over Mike's shoulder. "This is where they'll come from," Mike concluded. "They'll ride a sub through the straits, make a left into San Pablo Bay, then motorboated up into town. I bet they sent several teams out into the neighboring cities.